Okay, today's daf is Pei Gimel. We're going to start at the top of Pei Gimel. This is 83. Amud Aleph, second line. Choleh ma'achilin oto al pi beki'in. This is what we saw in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says that if somebody is sick on Yom Kippur, we feed him al pi beki'in, based upon the input of experts. However, it says that if there's no experts, we follow al pi atzmo. We follow what the Choleh himself says. We're on the next page. That's yesterday's page. We follow what the Choleh himself says. We're right here. So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yanai says, Choleh omer tzarich v'rofeh omer eno tzarich shom in the Choleh. If the sick person says, I need to eat on Yom Kippur, I know that I'm so sick, I'm going to die, we feed him, even if the doctor says he doesn't need. My tama, what's the reason? Lev yodeh amarat nafsho. Because the pasuk says, a heart knows the bitterness of its soul. In other words, we trust your subjective feeling that you need the food, even if the doctor says no. We trust what the patient feels. Pshita, isn't this obvious? Ma'udetema, what would you think? Rofeh kimle tefeh, maybe the doctor knows better. Right? Maybe you would think the doctor knows better and will overrule what the patient says based on the doctor. Kamashmalan, we therefore learn that no, if the patient says, I need to eat on Yom Kippurim, even if the doctor says no, we listen to the patient. Rofeh omer tzarich v'choleh omer eno tzarich shom'in la'rofeh. We also go the other way. Let's say the patient says, I don't need it, I'm fine. The doctor says he needs it. So, what do we do in that? So you might say what? Well, we follow the patient, right? No, we follow the doctor. My time, what's the reason? Maybe the patient is a little bit unaware. In other words, he's mentally impaired from his sickness. He can't really assess whether he needs it or not. Sometimes somebody's sick, they don't know what they need. They don't know what they need, right? So basically, so far we said if it's one against one, if either the doctor or the patient says that the patient needs to eat, he eats. If the patient says it, we override the doctor. If the doctor says it, we override the patient. Okay? So Tanan. But we learned in the Mishnah, Choleh ma'achilin oto al pi beki'in, al pi beki'in in, al pi atzmolo. Al pi beki'in in, al pi baki hadlo. There are two contradictions between the teaching of Rabbi Yanai and the teachings of our Mishnah. First of all, our Mishnah said, we feed a sick person al pi beki'in. We only feed the sick person based on the advice of experts, implying that if the patient says he needs to eat, but the expert says no, we don't listen to the patient. It says we only follow in our Mishnah it says when there are no experts, then we listen to the patient. But if they're experts, we don't listen to them. That's number one. Number two, our Mishnah says biki'in. Multiple, right? Plural. There's more than one. We need at least two doctors to say that he has to eat on Yom Kippur. Whereas Rabbi Yanai said, Rofeh omer. One doctor is enough. So how do we reconcile this? What are we talking about over here? The amar lo tzarichna. We're talking in our Mishnah about where the patient says, I don't need to eat. Okay? So, since the patient says he doesn't need to eat, right? Because Rabbi Yanai is talking about a situation where the patient says, I need to eat, right? And therefore we override what the doctor says, right? But in the Mishnah it's talking about where he says, I don't need to eat. V'lesfule al pi baki. So why don't we listen then to what one doctor says, right? Why the Mishnah you're telling me is talking about where the patient says, I don't need to eat, and the doctor says he does need to eat. So if that's the case, and that's why it says we listen to the baki, we listen to the doctor who says he does need to eat. But why does it say biki'in? Why does it say two? Why does it say two? The answer is lo tzaricha dika acharina bahadeh, that there are basically two people. The patient says I don't need to eat, and one doctor Smith says he doesn't need to eat. But Dr. Jones comes in and says he does need to eat. So it's one doctor against two. The patient and Dr. Smith against Dr. Jones. Dr. Jones is the only one who says he needs to eat. Okay, that's why it says al pi biki'in. We need there to be more than one baki, more than one rofeh. If there are two doctors against the patient and one doctor, if it's two against two, we'll let him eat, or we'll make him eat. But if it's the patient says he doesn't need to eat, and a doctor says he doesn't need to eat, okay, damar lo tarich, machilin oto al pi beki'in. In other words, since there is a doctor backing up the patient, saying that he doesn't need to eat, one doctor saying he does need to is not enough. Okay? But if two doctors say he needs to eat, even if the patient says I don't need to, and another doctor says he doesn't need to, the fact that there are two doctors saying he needs to is enough. Pshita, isn't this obvious? Safek nefashotu, usfek nefashot lahakel. Isn't that obvious? It's a doubt about saving a life. It's a doubt. We don't know which two of these people are right. The two doctors or the patient and the doctor. And since we don't know, obviously we have to be strict and we have to feed him. So why does the Mishnah need to tell us this? So that actually the Mishnah is talking about a case that's even more extreme. Even more extreme. There are three people saying the patient doesn't need to eat. Two doctors and the patient, all three of them say I don't need to eat. And two other doctors come along and say he must eat. So what will you say? Even though Rav Safra says when it comes to testimony, 2 are like 100 and 100 are like 2, right? If you have 2 witnesses to something, we don't say it's better if you had 100 witnesses. If there are 2 witnesses, we say that's enough. We don't distinguish. That's only true about edut, about testimony. But when it comes to umdana, when it comes to assessing something, evaluating something, such as the value of a certain property, what do? We go by the majority rules. We don't go by, well, if 2 say it, it must be true. No. If you have a panel of 10, and 8 of them tell you that the value is something, and 2 of them say something else, we don't say, well, because 2 of them said, we have to go with the 2. We don't say that. But the whole point is that what might you have thought? You might have thought like this. You have 2 against 3. 3 overrides 2. So since 3 are saying that he doesn't need to eat, the patient and 2 doctors saying he doesn't need to eat, the fact that you have 2 doctors saying he does need to eat, we'll say what? If you have 5 people judging something, okay, this is not testimony, where it's 2 against 2, 3 against 2, it's all the same thing. No, this is not testimony. This is evaluation. And when it comes to evaluation, how do you evaluate? On majority of opinions. That's why the Mishnah has to tell you that in this case, we don't go by majority. If 2 people say he needs to eat, even if it's against 100 doctors, we make him eat. That's enough of a doubt. We don't say, well, out of the 100, only 2% said that he needs to eat. We don't look at it that way. We said if there's even 2 that say he needs to eat, he needs to eat. So then the Gemara asks, but from the fact that the end of our Mishnah says that if there are no experts around, we feed him based on his own testimony, meaning we feed the patient based on his own testimony. That implies that the beginning of the Mishnah is talking about where the patient asks for food. Because what does our Mishnah say? The Mishnah says, if there are experts around, we listen to them. If there are no experts around, we feed the patient based on his own need. What does that imply? That in the first case, what? The patient is requesting food, but without experts validating him, we don't listen. And in the second case, when there are no experts, we rely on the patients, right? That's what it sounds like. It doesn't sound like the Mishnah is talking about a case where the patient says, I don't want food, and he has 2 other people saying he doesn't want food, and we're overriding him. That's not what it sounds like. Really, the Mishnah is missing something. This is what it means to say, when do we say that we need 2 doctors to oppose him? It's when he says, Lo tzarich ani, when he says, I don't need it, and he has 2 people backing him up. That's when we need 2 other experts saying he does need to eat in order to feed him. But if he says he needs it, en sham beki'in. Right? So, in that case, if there are no that if there are no experts there, okay, that say that he doesn't, even if there are people saying he doesn't need to eat, still we feed him based on his own testimony. Okay, that's the way that the Gemara reads the Mishnah now. Okay, so Rashi says on the side, Bamed Dvarim Amorim, that the machilin oto al pi beki'in. When do we feed him only with the consent of the experts? Kolomar de ba'inan beki'in. When do we need experts? De amar lo tzarich, va'amrei beki'in tzarich. So in that case, they said that you need experts to override him because he says he doesn't need any. And then machilin oto. Aval amar tzarich ani. But if he says I need to eat, right? So then im en sham beki'in trei damri lo tzarich elahad. If if there are no experts there that say he doesn't need. There's only one expert saying he doesn't need, right? That's why it says biki'in, experts. Okay? If there's only one expert, so in other words, if it's one doctor against the patient, we listen to the patient. And he says he needs to eat, we let him eat. That's what the Gemara is saying so far. But there's only one thing. So according to this interpretation, we don't always listen to the patient. If there are two rof'im against the patient says, I need to eat, and two doctors oppose him, we don't listen to the patient, according to this. When do we listen to the patient? If it's the patient against the doctor. Or, in a case where the patient says, I don't need to eat, and the doctor says, I do need to eat, then we override the patient. Right? Or in a case where even where two doctors say he needs to eat, then even if he has a whole bunch of doctors saying he doesn't need to eat, we still feed him. But if he says I need to eat alone, and he's opposed by two doctors, we don't listen to him, according to this. However, along comes somebody else to differ with that. Mor barav Ashi Amar. The Mor barav Ashi says, Kol echad amar tzarich ani afilu ikam me'ad amri lo tzarich ledideh sham'inan shremar lev yodea marat nafsho. According to Mor barav Ashi, no. If the patient says I need, we always listen. Even against 100 doctors. So when do the doctors overrule the patient? When the patient says, I don't need. Even if the patient has two doctors backing him up. If there are two doctors saying he needs to eat, even if the patient has 100 doctors backing up that he doesn't need to eat. If there are two legitimate doctors saying he needs to eat, we follow the doctors and we override the patient. But anytime the patient says, I need to eat, we always go with the patient. That's what Mor barav Ashi says. That's a machloket. The first version is saying that no, the patient is as good as a doctor, okay? So he can override another doctor, but he can't override two doctors to eat. According to Mor barav Ashi, anytime he says he needs to eat, we listen to him. The only time we can override him is if he says he doesn't need to eat. Very interesting. And that's what the halacha is, by the way. So now we said in the Mishnah, that if the patient says, I need to eat,
and two doctors
eat, no matter what. If he says I need to eat, he always eats.
Right.
If he says I don't need to eat, then even if he has doctors backing him up, if there are two doctors that say he needs to eat, we feed him. Okay? If there's one doctor opposing him saying that he needs to eat, we also listen to the doctor. But even if he has two other doctors backing him up, we don't listen to him if there were two doctors saying he needs to eat. That's it.
He always eats.
He always pretty much, any safek he eats, unless there's only one doctor and he has two doctors backing him up that he doesn't need to eat. Then he wouldn't eat. That wouldn't be a safek. There has to be at least two. It says if there are no experts there, then we feed him according to his own testimony. That implies that that's only when there are no experts. The implication is that when there are experts, we don't listen to the patient. Right? So this is what it means to say. It depends. That's when he says I don't need. That's when you need experts to override him. But if he says I need it, then with or without experts, we feed him because of the pasuk Lev Yodeh Marat Nafsho. The heart knows the bitterness of its own soul, and we rely on his subjective sense that he needs the food. So the only time experts come in is when he's claiming he doesn't need to eat, and we need to override him. Then we need experts to override him. But if he claims he needs to eat, we always listen to him. The Mishnah says, Misha chazo bulmus, somebody who is gripped by a bulmus, which is some kind of a condition that requires immediate food. This sounds like almost somebody going into diabetic shock or something like that. That's what it sounds like.
Life-threatening disease,
right?
By hunger.
Yeah, because like we know that some people go into like that diabetic state where they need to have sugar. So we're going to see that or the blood sugar plummets or something like that. That's what it sounds like from the description.
Exactly
right. From what the Gemara talks about when it describes the bulmus, it sounds like it means that the blood sugar plummets. We can feed even non-kosher food. This is talking about not just on Yom Kippurim, even during the week. We feed him even non-kosher foods until his eyes light up again. In other words, until he's functioning again. If somebody is bitten by a rabid dog, we don't feed it from. There used to be a sigula that they had, some kind of refuah sigulit, okay, some kind of a supernatural remedy, that they would take some piece of the dog's insides, in other words, it would kill the dog, and they would take something from next to its liver, some piece of fat, that they would feed to the person who was bit by the dog. Okay? Now, this would be done, but since it wasn't really a reliable refuah, it was some kind of supernatural refuah, or some kind of a questionable homeopathic, I don't know, whatever it wasn't considered serious, so the Tanakh says you can't do that.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Okay.
The Rambam explains that the laws of the Torah are suspended only for cures that had a scientific rationale,
Right.
or have been shown by experience to be effective.
Right, but this is not. However, Rav Matya ben Harash matir, Rav Matya ben Harash says, you know what? Rashi says, Kasava refuah gemurahi. According to Rashi, the machloket is whether this refuah is an established refuah or not. Whether feeding the bite victim, feeding him a piece of the dog's inner organs is going to cure him. Rav Matyas ben Harash says it's an established healing process.
Is it FDA approved? Or
Right, is it FDA approved or not? Right, exactly. The Tanakh Abba says this is not FDA approved, this is still in experimental stages, we don't buy it. According to Rav Matya ben Harash, it's good. That's the way Rashi interprets it. But according to that, what is the machloket between the Tanakh Abba and Rav Matya ben Harash? It's a medical machloket.
Yeah.
They're arguing about medicine. Right, whereas according to the Rambam, it's a different machloket. According to the Rambam, the question is, can you override halacha for what's called refuah sigulit, for something which is a supernatural remedy?
Right.
Okay? According to the Tanakh Amma, you cannot, because it's not a scientific remedy, it's some kind of a supernatural kind of remedy. And according to Rav Matya ben Harash, you can. And the Rambam, I believe, explained somewhere that the reason why is because even though he doesn't believe that they really work, the Rambam says it doesn't really work. The only thing is psychologically it can have a placebo effect sometimes, and it will help the person. Right? So therefore maybe you can override it for that sake. You know. Anyway, so in any case, Rav Matya ben Harash, and furthermore, Rav Matya ben Harash says, if somebody has some pain in their throat, matilin lo sam betoch pi b'Shabbat, they can give him medicine on Shabbat, mipnei shu safek nefashot, because it's a threat to life. V'chol safek nefashot dochayet Shabbat, and any doubt about life and death overrides Shabbat. And we're going to see in the Gemara that obviously, you can give him medicine on Shabbat. That's not the question. The question is, you can even prepare the medicine on Shabbat because his life is in danger. So if a building collapses and you don't know if the person is inside or not, you don't know if he's alive or dead, you don't know if he's Jewish or not Jewish, you clear away the entire rubble in order to find him. You know that there might have been somebody in there. And then when you find him, if he's alive, you continue clearing it away in order to save his life. If he's already dead, there's nothing you can do. Right? You leave him until after Shabbat. But if you can save him, then of course you do whatever you need to do. The Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, how do they know Mishiyeh Oroinav? It says you should feed the person who has a bulmus, you feed him whatever you need to feed him until his eyes light up. What does it mean his eyes light up? It means Mishiyah Hayin ben Tov Dara. He can tell the difference between a good taste and a bad taste. Apparently one of the conditions of somebody who's in this bulmus is that they can't tell the difference between food that tastes good and food that tastes bad. Okay? Amar Abaye says, Uvta'ama. And that means by taste. In other words, whether it tastes good or bad, not whether it is good or bad. Maybe it's the finest delicacy in some African country, but that doesn't mean it tastes good for a Western person. So it has to be something that tastes good. That a person who has the bulmus, he has this some kind of a drop in blood sugar or whatever it is, you feed him the lesser sin first. If you're in a situation where you must feed him some kind of a dvarim asurim, you have to feed him some machalot asurot, they say, some forbidden foods. You feed him the least evil first. You don't switch to the most stringent. So how so? Tevel unvela. You have tevel, you have produce that you haven't separated terumah from yet, and you have nevela, meat that wasn't slaughtered properly. So it's nevela. Nevela, the penalty is whipping for eating nevela, like a McDonald's hamburger or something like that. What's the penalty for eating tevel? Mita bidei shamayim. Very serious. Death by the hands of heaven. Very serious. So we feed him nevela. Okay. Tevel ushvi'it. You have tevel. You have the untithed produce where the penalty is mita bidei shamayim, and you have shvi'it, you have the produce of the 7th year, which means you were allowed to take the produce of the 7th year into your house. But once there was no more vegetation outside, you had to clear it out from your house. There had to be enough outside for the animals and other people to come take. Once it wasn't available to everyone, you couldn't have it in your house. You had to get rid of it. So what about those perot shvi'it that you had in your house that you're supposed to get rid of? And could you feed them to the sick person? You have that, or you have tevel. What do? Then shvi'it. You feed him shvi'it, because that is only a violation of a positive mitzvah. Right? You're failing to get rid of the produce from the 7th year. But it's not as stringent, obviously, as tevel. Tevel u'truma tanaihi. What about tevel versus truma? In other words, you have a situation, the guy is sick, he's not a kohen. If I separate from this truma, I have this chulin. I didn't separate, it's tevel, I didn't separate tithes from it. Yes, I didn't separate truma from it. If I feed it to him, it's mita bidei shamayim every bite. Right? If I separate out the teruma, I have teruma, he's not a kohen. So it's also mita bidei shamayim. So what's worse? Right? So the question, so it's a machloket tanaim. The Tanya is willing to write the machilin oto tevel ven machilin oto teruma. That according to the Tanakama, better to feed him the tevel, not the teruma. Why? And we'll see in a second why. Ben tema omer teruma velo tevel. And Ben tema said, no, it's better to feed him teruma, not tevel. So we'll see why this is in a second. So. Amar Rabba said, in other words, if you have so much untithed produce, you have a huge pile of produce, that you could separate the teruma and give him whatever's left of the chulin, and it's enough, then certainly you wouldn't feed him the teruma. And certainly you wouldn't feed him the tevel. You would separate out the teruma and feed him the chulin, of course. The question is when you know you're not going to have enough. In other words, if I separate out the teruma, and now what's left over is not going to be enough. So should I feed it to him as is without separating out the teruma? Should I feed it to him as is, as tevel, as untithed produce, which is in and of itself a violation to eat that produce? Or should I separate out the teruma? So for 90% of what he's eating, it's chulin. That 10% that he eats is teruma. So at least only 10% of what he's going to eat is going to be in a violation. Because he's not a kohen, right? So that seems to make sense. So he says, keep it live shot. More savar tevel hamor, more savar teruma hamura. More savar tevel hamor about teruma chazel kohen. More savar teruma hamura about tevel efshal takune. So the question is, which one do we treat more stringently? On one hand, we could say that teruma is more stringent. Why? Because you will never be able to eat teruma. You're not a kohen. Whereas tevel, you could tithe it and eat that food. So 90% of what's in that pile you could eat. So in a way, tevel is not as strict. Why? Because if I just remove the teruma from there, I'll be able to eat the same grain. Whereas the teruma, once you identify it, you could never eat it if you're not a kohen. On the other hand, tevel, nobody's allowed to eat. Even a kohen is not allowed to eat tevel. He's only allowed to eat it after it's processed and the teruma is separated. Right? But teruma, at least a kohen is allowed to eat. So yes, you're not a kohen, but at least somebody's allowed to eat that. It's not completely non-kosher. So that's why we have
one is tied to time
or process. Right, and one is absolute. So what do? So we turn to Amud Bet. Efshar bechulin pshita. When you're able to satisfy the need of the sick person with just the chulin. In other words, you have 100 measures of produce. You could separate out your 10% of teruma, and whatever's left over will be enough. So it's obvious that that you should do that. I mean, what's the question? What's the question, right? So the Gemara says, "Let's richa b'Shabbat." We're talking about on Shabbat. Why Shabbat? Because Rashi says, "Shafilu Shabbat shasol afrish teruma u'maaser yafrishua." That means that if the guy goes into this state of sickness on Shabbat, what should we do? Should we just feed him the tevel right away, or should we separate it out? Because we know if we separate the teruma from the pile, then 90% that's left will be enough. We're violating Shabbat because you're not allowed to separate teruma on Shabbat.
So wait, I'm confused because we're talking about the Yom Kippur that falls on Shabbat. Because we're
not talking about Yom Kippur. We're just talking about somebody who falls into sickness and the only food that you have around is
Okay.
The only food that you have around is non-kosher. This is not Yom Kippur.
Okay,
Anytime.
We're talking any day.
Any day.
And the only issue we're talking about
is a kashrut issue.
The kashrut issue.
Right. So what happens if I have a situation where, okay, in front of me is the tevel. If I separate out the teruma, I'm doing a violation of Shabbat by separating teruma, but then I'll be able to feed the choleh purely kosher food. Or do I say, no, better not to violate the Shabbat and feed it to him as is? So what Rabbah is saying is that you should feed him, you should separate the teruma, even though it's a rabbinic violation of Shabbat, and then feed him the chulin, because there's enough chulin. So the Gemara says, pshita, b'Shabbat nami pshita, tiltul mi derabananu. But that whole halacha that you're not allowed to separate teruma is rabbinic. So what's the question? Of course you should separate out the teruma and feed him the chulin. You're talking about an isur deoraita of eating tevel. Of course you should, against the derabanan. Of course you should separate out the teruma so you only feed him kosher food. Why would you even have a question? When there's not going to be enough kosher food if you separate the teruma, there we understand it's an issue. But when there's going to be enough and all that's involved is a rabbinic transgression, of course you should separate the teruma. So therefore the Gemara says, and what must we be talking about then? Ba'atzit she'eino nakuv derabanan. That we're talking about a case where the entire situation is derabanan. Namely, atzitz she'eino nakuv. Atzitz she'eino nakuv means basically like greenhouse grown things, where you are growing, these things are not grown in the ground. Okay, they're not grown in the actual land, they are grown in atzitz she'eino nakuv, which means they're grown in a pot which is not perforated. Okay? They're not implanted in the ground. And therefore, whatever obligations of tiruma and ma'aser are on this produce, it's only rabbinic to begin with. So the question is, should I just feed him tevel midirabanan? Should I feed him tiruma dirabanan? Should I separate out the tiruma, which is a violation of a dirabanan, so I can feed him something which is allowed even dirabanan? Right? In other words, if I have this produce in front of me that's rabbinically obligated in tiruma because it grew in, it didn't grow in the ground. It grew in a pot. So if I feed him the tevel, what am I feeding him? An isur derabanan. If I don't separate out the truma, I'm only feeding him an isur derabanan. In order to fix it, I need to commit an isur derabanan, because I need to separate it on Shabbat. So what's worse? Should I separate it on Shabbat, violating an isur derabanan, but now whatever I feed him is 100% kasher, even rabbinically? Or should I just say, I'm violating a rabbinic prohibition anyway, just feed it to him as is? And therefore he's saying, that's what Rabba's chidush was, that what? That mor savar tevel hamor, mor savar teruma hamura, that even within the rabbinic framework, the question was, what should be done? If it's Shabbat, Rabbah is saying one should separate it out, do the one action of violating Shabbat rabbinically in order to make all of the food kasher, since you're going to have enough food for the choleh in that case. And if it's any other situation, that's where you have the machloket. Is tevel worse? Is it worse to feed him the food as is when you're not going to have enough? In other words, if you separate out the truma, you're not going to have enough. So should you feed it to him 90% tithe produce and 10% truma, or should you just feed him 100% tevel? What's worse? That was where the machloket was. Lema tanaihi. Maybe this is actually a machloket tanaim. Why? The Tanya, as we learned in the Braita, nachash, somebody who was bitten by a snake. Okay? In other words, this idea of Rabbah, Rashi says, the amar be'efshar be'chulein mitakninan le ve'dahinan shivut da'afrashat teruma b'shabbat. In other words, the idea that you should violate the rabbinic prohibition in order to release the food from another rabbinic prohibition, if there's going to be enough. Right? That was what Rabbah said to do. So this is actually a machloket tanaim. How so? Because if somebody was bitten by a snake, or in the rofeh mimakom lamakom, you can call a doctor from one place to another. In other words, even if the doctor has to travel on Shabbat, you can tear open a chicken for it. And Rashi says lateta lamakah, because you would place the innards of the chicken on the wound, on the snake bite. It would help heal it. Okay, and you can cut. In other words, you can harvest for him karishin, the leeks, and feed him. Okay, and you don't have to take maaser from them. In other words, you can take these vegetables and feed it to him, and you don't have to take maaser. You don't have to take maaser from them. Because you're in an emergency, you just take the vegetables and you feed it to him. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon Omer, lo yochal ad she'aser. that Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon says, no, really, you need to separate the tithes. So, Neema Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, he below Rabbi.
You need to take the maaser only if you're taking the maaser would endanger the life. What if It's
but no, because it's Shabbat. It's Shabbat. So the question is, should you take the truma? Should you separate or not? Yeah. So it looks like Rabbah is saying, oh, for sure, if there's if you have 100 measures of produce and you need to separate out 10 of them, and the 90 that are left will be good enough for the patient, you should definitely separate them. Remove the prohibition, separate it, even though it's asur to do that on Shabbat. You're not allowed to, but you know what? Minimize the transgression. Do it. So, but you see from here that no, Rabbi is saying, don't do it. Don't separate the maaser. It's Shabbat. Just feed it to him as is. And what does Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon say? Separate the maaser. So you see that he's agreeing with Rabbah. Rabbah is following Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon.
It's not clear why he says that. In other words, it's not clear because if
that's true. But so far,
do it. In other words, or is he saying it because the fact of you doing it is actually going to endanger the life of the...
No, that's definitely not why. Because if that were the case, then it wouldn't even be a question.
Right.
That wouldn't even be a question then. Right? So the Rashi says on the side, Had Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimoni, Damar mafrishin lo tiroma v'Shabbat val yachiluhu tevel dirabanan kigon yarak velo Rabbi di Rabbi ha'amar enterach la'aser. In other words, Rabbi is saying definitely like Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon, because he's saying he should definitely take the maaser even on Shabbat, so that when the sick person eats the food, he's not going to transgress. So the Gemara answers no. Afilu, you could say no, that's not the case. That Afilu tema Rabbi, that Rabbah could agree with Rabbi. How so? Because Ad kan lo kama Rabbi hatam el inyan maaser yarak de Rabbanan. Aval b'maaser dagan tetevel deoraitahu afilu Rabbi modeh deisharit le b'atzitz she'eno nakuv atela mechal b'atzitz she'hu nakuv. That basically, what does Rabbi say? So the Gemara answers nicely and says like this: that Rabbi and Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, when are they arguing? They're arguing about leeks. They're arguing about vegetables. Vegetables, even if they grow from the ground, the obligation to take maaser is only rabbinic. So that's why Rabbi says, listen, the obligation is only rabbinic anyway. So it's it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. Why should you separate out the Teruman Maaser? It's only a rabbinic requirement. You're violating a rabbinic rule of separating the Teruman Maaser. Why? So the sick person won't eat a rabbinic thing. It's all rabbinic. Okay, so therefore, that's why Rabbi says he doesn't have to separate the maaser.
And all rabbinic rules are treated equal, and that was one.
Yeah, basically, sort of. But wait. But Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon says no. He should still separate out the maaser, like Rabbah says. But the only thing is that's talking about a vegetable. But let's say you had, like the actual case of Rabbah, you had grain growing in a pot. Grain growing, not in the ground. Where if it were growing in the ground, the obligation would be deoraita. Right. It's only rabbinic because of an accident, so to speak, because of where it's growing, not because of the substance. Right? So there's more reason to be stringent. And there, even Rabbi would agree you should separate the maaser before feeding the patient. Why? Because even though this particular batch of produce didn't grow in the ground, if that produce had grown in the ground, it would be biblical tevel.
In other words, it became rabbinic by hapstance. In other words, It did not. It was not
because of where it grew, not because of what it is.
Right.
So therefore, if you tell the person, "Oh, don't worry, don't separate the maaser and truma, just feed the patient," because it was grown in a pot and not grown in the ground, you might come to think the same thing when it was grown in the ground, where it's actually biblical tevel. And there, we would certainly say violate the rabbinic prohibition of separating truma rather than feeding in biblical tevel. Of course. So therefore, in our case, everyone would agree, since we're dealing with grains that if they were planted in the ground would be biblical tevel, okay, then even when they're only rabbinic tevel, in other words, even when they're grown in a pot, we say better to separate out the teruman maaser even on Shabbat, feed the patient food that is kasher lemehadrin, and not lead to any confusion, and that's what Rabbah says. So now the Gemara goes on to Rabbah, and we learned in the Baraita Misha somebody who has a bulmus. Again, it seems like this is a reference to the blood sugar plummeting, because what does it tell you to do? Feed him honey and all kinds of sweet things. Because honey and all kinds of sweet things enlighten the eyes of a person. And even though there's no proof for that, there is a hint for that. And where's the hint? The hint is in the story of Shaul HaMelech, when Yonatan went with his assistant to infiltrate the battle with the Pelishtim, and then he comes back and he didn't hear that Shaul told the people nobody's allowed to eat today. Shaul declared a fast, and so there was some honey in the forest that they were going through, and Yonatan took some and ate it, and everyone said, "Whoa, you're a bad guy. Why did you violate the oath?" And he didn't know about the oath. So in any case, it says there that Re'u na ki oru enai ki ta'amti ma'advash hazeh, because Yonatan says, "Look, my eyes have lit up because I had this little bit of honey." Meaning Yonatan criticized his father, which was really his sin in that case. It wasn't that he ate the honey because he didn't know about the fast. The sin was that when they told him that his father made a fast, declared a fast, he said, "Look at how my father's ruining everything." Right? He said, "Look, my father, Vayomer Yonatan, achar avi et haaretz, my father's ruining the land, polluting the land with his silly fast. Look how much better I feel because I had a little honey."
No fun.
Okay, so he was criticized. That's why that was really the sin of Yonatan, because he criticized his father like that. In any case, the point is that from eating a little bit of honey, what happens? The eyes light up. That's where we see it from Yonatan.
It's diabetes.
Right, doesn't it sound like that? That's what I was saying. It sounds like they're talking about low blood sugar, right? That's what it sounds like.
He's just explaining to his father that
he didn't have diabetes, but it's saying that, it gave him energy, right?
he felt
His father gave an order, and instead of saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, I made a mistake," he criticized and said, "Oh, what a bad thing." Yeah, that's a whole other story. But in any case, that's the hint. Oh my! Why is it that it's not a proof? Why is it not a proof from Yonatan that honey makes your eyes light up? Very simply because he wasn't suffering from bulmus. He didn't have low blood sugar. Okay, he wasn't have any kind of medical problem. He was just saying that the honey helped him to re-energize. Right, so we're drawing from that also a person who is having a bulmus, that this can help them to re-energize. And now we move on. That Amar Abai says, "Lo shanu ella harachila." It's only true that they should have honey and they should have sweet things after they eat something. But if they don't eat something first, it will make them want even more. Dichtiv, as it says, "Vayimtzu ish mitzri basadeh," says that they found an Egyptian man in the field. Vaychuoto el David, they brought him to David, and vayitnu lo lechem vayochal vayashku mayim, and they gave him bread and water. Vayitnu lo pelach devela, and then they gave him a slice of pressed figs. Ushnei tzimukim, and they gave him some raisins, and vayochal, and it says that he ate. Vatashov rucho elav. Okay, and then his soul returned to him because he had not eaten or drank anything for 3 days and 3 nights. In other words, what does it show you? Before they gave him the sweet things, the raisins and the date and the figs, they gave him first food. They first gave him bread and water, so that's necessary as well. Amar Rav Nachman bar Shmuel. Rav Nachman bar Shmuel said, Rav Nachman said that Shmuel says, Misha chaza bulmus machilin oto aliyah bidvash. A person who gets a bulmus, they should feed him the fatty tail of the animal with honey. In other words, he should get protein as well as honey. Rav Huna the son of Rav Yoshua said, Amar afsolet nikiyah bidvash. Even pure flour with honey is good. Rav Papa Amar afilu kimchi desarei b'divsha. Rav Papa said even barley flour, which was coarse, with honey is good enough. Amar Rabbi Yochanan says, Pam achad achazani bulmus. Once I was gripped by a bulmus, v'ratzti lamizraha shel te'ena, v'kiyabdi b'atzmi ha'chochma techaya b'alea. I ran to the eastern side of a fig tree, and I fulfilled in myself the verse, wisdom keeps its possessor alive. Ha'chochma techaya b'alea. That wisdom keeps its possessor alive. Why? Because he knew that the eastern side of the tree was the place to go. Ditani Rav Yosef, that a person who wants to taste the real taste of a fig should go to the east side of the tree. From the delicacies of the tivuot shamish, the produce of the sun. And since the eastern side of the tree gets the best sun, that's where the best fruit is. So he used his wisdom. Rabbi Yochanan used his wisdom that he knew that the eastern side of the tree would have the ripest, juiciest fruit. right? Sugariest fruit, let's say. So he ran to the eastern side of the tree in order to get to benefit from that knowledge that he had. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, once Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi were walking on the way. Achazei bulmus, Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda was gripped with a bulmus. He went and attacked a shepherd that was walking by, and he stole his bread and ate it. That's pretty crazy. Amali Rabbi Yossi said to him, you attacked the shepherd. How could you do that? Of course, I'm sure he went and paid him back afterwards, but the point was he needed to take the food. It was an emergency. And when they came to the city, now it was Rabbi Yossi's turn. Rabbi Yossi had a bulmus. What did he do? The entire city came out and brought him all kinds of food. They brought him... It says, they surrounded him with honey, with containers of honey, and sweets, and plates of food. Okay? Balagay are the lagay are the containers of honey, and the tza'eh are the plates of food. So Amar le Rabbi Yehuda says, I overtook the shepherd and took his bread, but you got the entire city. The entire city gave you their food. So who's the bigger robber of the two of us? V'tu Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, and in a further story, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi havuka azli b'orcha. They once came. They were traveling and they came to an inn. This doesn't directly have to do with the bulmos, but it's a very interesting story. Rabbi Meir havay dayik b'shma. Rabbi Meir was always midayik. He always interpreted people based on their names. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi lo havu dayik b'shma. But Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi did not infer things from people's names. Ki matula havuduchta. They came to a certain place, but ushpiza yavulu. They sought lodging. And they got it. Amrulo, Mashim Shimcha. They asked him, "What is your name? What is the name of the innkeeper?" Okay, they used to have, not necessarily like a hotel, but they had like a bed and breakfast sort of place. They would have like extra rooms in their house that they would host people. Amar lo, he said to them, Kidor. My name is Kidor. Amar, Rabbi Meir said, Sheba mina Adam Rashahu. He must be a wicked person. Shiremar Kidor tapuchotema. Right? It's an overturned generation. It's a generation that has its values upside down, right? Dor tapuchot. So he says, Kidor is a bad sign. So, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, Ashli Molei Kisayu, they left their wallets with him over Shabbat. Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda, because they didn't care about the name, but Rabbi Meir, Lo Ashlim, like you say. But Rabbi Meir did not leave his wallet with this gentleman because he suspected that he might be a bad guy based on his name. So then what happened? It says Azal, and according to the version that the Bach has on the side, it says Azil Rabbi Meir Otvei Bechada, that Rabbi Meir went and he put it in a container. I'm reading from the Bach on the side. V'kavrei bekavrei davua, dahu gavra bereshe, and he buried it next to the head of the owner, the innkeeper's father's grave. Okay, that's what he did. So then what happened? So that night the innkeeper had a dream where his father came to him and said, come take the wallet that's by the head of this person. In other words, Rebbe Meir went and he hid his wallet in the graveyard by the head of the innkeeper's father, where he was buried. But the innkeeper has a dream. His father's like, go take the money. The next morning he said, this is what I saw in my dream. They said to him, Friday night dreams don't mean anything. They're not significant. Beis Shimshei means Friday night. Rashi says, Mitoch Shadam b'mnucha, because a person is resting on Friday night. So it says that he sees all kinds of fantastical things in his dreams on Friday night because he's so well rested. Of course, Rabbi Meir is saying that because he doesn't want the guy to go check and dig up his wallet and take it. So anyway, Azal Rabbi Meir untarek kula yoma, just in case Rabbi Meir went and sat in the graveyard all Shabbat to make sure that he never came to take it. And then he took it with him. So he has his wallet. But lemachar amrulo, the next day they said to the guy, Havlan Kisan, give us our wallets back. Amalahu, lo ayu dvarim me'olam. He said, you never gave me any wallet. What are you talking about? Show me the receipt. What? I don't have your wallet. So he denied it. So what happens? Rabbi Meir said to them, why didn't you daikitu? Why weren't you midayek? Why weren't you analyzing bishma? Right? So he says, Amailo daikitu bishma? Why did you not infer from his name that he was a bad guy? Amrulay, they said to him, Amaylo Amadlan Mor. Why didn't you say something to us? Amarlo. He said to them, Emar da Amri ana hashasha ahzuke mi Amri. He said, you can tell me, I might have had my doubts, but I didn't know for sure that this guy was bad. I wasn't going to badmouth him to you. I was just following my own thing. I saw that his name was questionable. I didn't want to trust him. But I wasn't going to go tell you, Lashon Hara, about this guy without any proof. So I didn't want to say anything. But you guys should learn from this to have doubts when you hear somebody has a suspicious name. Mashchu v'ailuhu l'chanuta. They said, you know what? Forget about the whole thing about our wallets. Let's go out for some beers. They went out to drink with him.
How are they going to pay for it?
Right, I don't know. I guess they had to, maybe it was on him. They went out to have some drinks. So what happens? It says, Ashkiwa, in the Bach's version, which is signified by the Gimel here, it should say, Ashkiwa Hamra, they gave him some wine. And Chazu Tilapche Asfame, they saw on his mustache some lentils. They saw what he had for lunch, right? For lunch, I said lentils, and he didn't wipe his mouth. So, Azlu v'yahavu siman aledevitu. They went to his house and they said to his wife, your husband said to return our wallets, and the sign is, he said you had lentils for lunch. How could we know that if we weren't talking to him? He said to tell you as the sign you had lentils. Oh, okay. V'shaklu lekisayu. They took their wallets. Va'aitu, and they went.
No, because
Right.
they said, when you have my macharon.
Yeah, but we didn't get to that part. We didn't get to that part yet, right? So what happens? So they took their v'shaklu lekisayu va'aitu. Azal ihu, when he got home, katle le'itate, he killed his wife. He said, how could you give him their wallets by killing his wife? And therefore, what did they say? Hainu, this is what it's taught, and it should be what? It should be Hainu. Oh, it shouldn't be Ditzan because it's not in the Mishnah. It should be Hainu Ditanya. Mayim Rishonim. Okay, that water that you wash before the meal. Hechilu besar hazir. Mayim achronim hargot nefesh. Mayim achronim killed somebody. In other words, that the story about Mayim Rishonim was that there was a guy. Rashi explains, Pundak Yisrael haya mocher Yisrael dvarim amutorim umachilam umocher lenochrim besar hazir mevushal. That there was a guy who had a kosher and non-kosher store at the same time. If somebody came in that they were a Jew, he fed them the kosher. If they came in and they were non-Jew, he fed them the non-kosher. Somebody came in and didn't wash his hands in Netilat Yadayim, so the owner said, oh, he must be a non-Jew, he fed him pork. So that's what it says. Because of failing to do Mayim Rishonim, what happened? The guy ate pork. Mayim Achronim, this guy who had the lentils, he didn't do Mayim Achronim, because when you do Mayim Achronim, you're also supposed to wipe your mouth. It's brought that you're supposed to also wipe your mouth. So he didn't wipe his mouth. So therefore he left some food on his mouth, and that's what caused him Harigot HaNefesh, because he gave a signal to them what he had for lunch. They used that against him, and it caused his wife to be killed. So therefore you see Mayim Achronim could kill somebody.
That everybody at the time had beard.
Yeah, mustache, beard, yeah. So, kimat. So then it says, ulevasov havu daike bishma, and they learned from this what to be careful about the meaning of names, right? So, and Rashi actually says this, says that derech hanotlim yadayim lekanech etzfamam biyadayim tovchot. That they would wipe their hands wipe their face while their hands are still wet. So in any case, after that they learned to be careful about names. Bala, they came to someone's house and his name was Bala. Whither away, right? Not a good name. So lo ailu legabe, they didn't go there because Amrei Shmaminam Rashahu. Because you could see that he's a wicked person. How do we know that? That he said to the one weary with ni'ufim. Weary with immorality.
Adultery.
Okay, adultery. Uchimo achare beloti hayetali edna. Klomar zekena baniufim. In other words, bala baniufim means like the word beloti that Sarah says about herself. After veloti, after I'm worn out, I'm going to have joy again. I'm going to have children again after I'm worn out. So bala baniufim means aged with immorality. Bala ben Yofim, worn out from all the immorality of all the years. So when they saw that his name was Bala, they said, not a good place to stay. We learned our lesson the first time. If somebody has a name that sounds suspicious, we're not going to stay with them. We're not going to trust them. They learned their lesson from the story of losing their wallets.